Hello everyone, we have gathered here for the discussion of this year's mains examination paper, that is the 2024 mains examination paper related to the section of society and social justice. Now in this section constitutes one of the important parts of the mains examination because the weightage of the society in the general studies paper 1 and the weightage of social justice to some extent in the general studies paper 2 is consistently somewhere around 120 to 130 marks, right? The weightage of the society has increased considerably in this year's examination, where it was almost about 100 years in the GS paper 1. So in this discussion video, we are going to take the discussion of the questions that were asked, the approach that you needed to have, and a kind of analysis of what questions have been asked this year from which particular topics. Now, for example, in the syllabus, it has been mentioned that population issues is one of the topics in our syllabus of Indian society. Based on that only, this particular question has been asked in this year's examination for 10 marks. What is the concept of demographic winter? Is the world moving towards such a situation? Elaborate. Now, this basically is a question that is related to overall demographic trend at a world level. It is not restricted to any one particular country. It wants you to analyze the change in the demographic scenario, the change in the population scenario at the global level. For example, so it wants you to analyze the demographic scenario at the world level. Now, in this, the first thing that one should know or one should explain in the answer is what exactly is meant by this term demographic winter. Now, winter is something that is normally associated with an idea that everything comes to a standstill. It's a kind of situation where the growth is not happening much. Agree? So this has been associated with the idea that in the demography, are we witnessing a period where the population growth rates have stabilized, or are they reducing in some parts of the world and at the world level as a whole? That is the main demand of this question, right? And we are required to answer that, is the world moving towards such a situation? Now, this question has been asked in the context of the decline in population that is being witnessed. Decline in population that is being witnessed in many of the European countries and some of the East Asian countries also. The prominent examples being Italy. Germany is also facing a situation of saturation of the population, right? Also, countries like Japan and South Korea. Now, here the decline in the population is primarily because of decline in fertility rate. Is primarily because of decline in fertility rates. That has been one of the inherent causes of the decline in the population. So, mostly in the European countries, there has been a trend of the decline in the fertility rates. However, on the other hand, we know that in the developing countries, the population has been growing considerably. For example, in India's case, in China's case, the population is the highest and it has been growing also. But this growth rate also in India's case, in India's case and in China's case is witnessing a decline. In European countries, the fertility rate has declined below the replacement level. However, in case of India and China, although it is still at the replacement level, in case of China, it has dropped below the replacement level. But we find that despite having a huge population base across the globe, their populations are also witnessing decline. For example, in case of India, we witness one of the notions that for example, in case of India, we see that there is a north-south divide in terms of population growth. We see that there is a north-south divide in terms of the fertility rates, where the fertility rates are declining in the southern India and they are still high in the northern India, right? So if you look at the global scenario, definitely in most of the Western countries, even in countries like America, the growth rates of the population has declined or has remained stagnant, right? In case of developing countries like India and China, which are the biggest contributor to the global demography, their rates are also stagnating. In case of India, we're witnessing that by 2044, our fertility rates will be below the replacement level fertility. Now, this creates a typical situation for the world. This is a situation because the demography has been one of the important inputs in the economic growth rates of the country. Because the young age population contributes to the labor force. The young age population contributes to the labor force, right? And in countries where this young age population is declining, they have a crisis of labor force. Not just this, if the labor force is declining, if the population of young people is declining, it is necessarily understood as the increase in the old age population, right? There is an inherent idea that the old age population burden in the country will be more. If this old age population burden is more in a country, it is a scenario where these people will require what? So many social security initiatives. They will require so many social security initiatives, which will again be a burden on the government exchequer. Right? So it is not just associated with a trend in the decline in the population, it is also associated with the idea and the problem that it is going to increase the burden on the governments in terms of their spending. The spending will have to be in particular direction because the proportion of the old age population in that particular nation will be more, and the people who are young and working in the labor force will be less. This scenario is called as the dependency ratio increasing. It is said that the dependency ratio in these countries is increasing in such a scenario. Right? So on the whole, we can substantiate this by first explaining the definition of what is demographic winter, then highlighting the trends in terms of how the trend has been of declining population in the European countries, in countries like Japan, in countries like South Korea, etc. And we can again highlight the idea that even in developing countries like India and China, which have the highest proportion in the global population today, their rates are also declining to some extent or the other. For example, you might be remembering, China has recently done away with its one-child policy. One-child policy. Why? Because they saw that it is going to change the demography in such a manner that after a point, the old age population will be more, which will be more dependent on the lesser young age population. So it's a kind of demographic transition that is being witnessed in such scenarios. So you need to highlight in the end and conclude by saying that yes, to some extent the world is witnessing a decline in the fertility rates and we are moving towards a scenario which has been termed as demographic winter. However, there are certain other areas like the African continent, which still has high fertility rates, right? However, because of the lack of health services, because of lack of health care for the mothers, and maternal mortality rate is high in such countries. So these things can be incorporated while writing such kind of answers. This next question reads that distinguish between the concepts of gender equality, gender equity, and women's empowerment. The next part of the question requires why is it important to take gender concerns into account in program design and implementation. Now you see the terms equity, equality, they are colloquially used interchangeably. However, they have a distinct meaning. Now, if you look at this term gender equality, equality simply means what? You have equal treatment, opportunities, and access to resources in a country in the context of gender. For example, normally we associate the gender with male and female. This simply is a scenario where you feel that everybody is having equal opportunity to furnish or to use these opportunities that are there. They have the equal opportunities for access to resources and they are treated in such a manner. They are treated that you are treated equally. You will not be provided any cushion by the government or the state. That is the concept of equality. However, equity is defined in a manner which takes into account fairness and justice. It takes into account the idea of fairness and justice, right? Why? Because you see, in a country like India, which has had a patriarchal attitude for a very long period of time, the position of the women has been vulnerable. The position of the female gender in the Indian society has not been that great. In such a scenario, what do you do? In such a scenario, you will have to create a scenario where you are going to do what? You are going to provide support. You're going to provide support, right? You're going to provide them positive kind of reinforcement. It is going to be an additional support as compared to the male members of the society, so that they can avail these opportunities that are there. So it's a different perspective where you also look into account if both the genders which are being treated equally in the concept of gender equality, does any of the gender requires any kind of support, and that support, if it is required, it leads to the notions of fairness and justice that we see here. And that is why in such a scenario, in the fairness and the justice scenario, you feel that you are required to provide certain support. This support becomes necessary because of, let's say, historical injustices. Historical injustices, or maybe historical deprivation that has been there, or some structural problems in the system where women have been given a lower position in the society as compared to the men of the society. And that is why the equity as a concept comes up. Associated with the idea of the equity is the idea of women's empowerment, which simply means what? You're going to create conditions, you're going to create policies which are going to empower the women to take their own decisions, and their dependency on the male will be decreased considerably. That is the scenario of women empowerment, where you're going to create policies which are going to function in a manner in which you will focus upon the idea of empowering the women who can take their own decisions. Right? So first part, you have to define these three terms, that is gender equality, gender equity, and women's empowerment, by contrasting and highlighting the difference between the terms equality and equity in the first place. And in the context of the equity, we require the idea of women's empowerment. Then you go on to address the second part of the question, that is, why is it important to take gender concerns into account in program design and implementation? Because what would happen in a scenario in which the gender concerns have not been taken into account while formulating a policy or while designing a policy by the government? In such a scenario, what would happen is, let's say you have created a policy, right? And you treat that this policy, let's say you have created a skill development program. A skill development program which, let's say, treats both the men and women equally, right? But will the women be able to avail those opportunities under the skill development program? Because of the structural inequalities that are there in the society. Because of the structural inequalities that are there in the society, right? So that is why there is a need first, in terms of various neutral policies, there is a need that we provide certain extra opportunity to the women so that they can avail these policies in the first place. Right? Secondly, we need to focus upon a different kind of policies which are specifically focusing upon the women's empowerment. Specifically focusing upon women's empowerment, because that is going to create a condition where they could avail those opportunities, avail those policies, and arrive at an equal position with that of the women, with that of the men. They require a cushion, they require a support. These women empowerment policies can be what? For example, you would provide them healthcare facilities, which will be specifically catering to the needs of the women, right? For example, in times of pregnancy, in times of maternal care, these policies are required. For example, you're going to create policies for the education of the women, right? Not just this, you're going to create policies for what? Social welfare, so that women who are at the receiving end of sometimes issues like domestic violence, they need to be treated in a particular manner so that domestic violence does not happen, right? Women have been at the receiving end of various social crimes like rapes, stalking, etc., right? Conditions, for example, working conditions for the women have been miserable because of the male attitudes in the office spaces. That is why Vishaka guidelines were required in the first place. So in such a scenario, that is why we can justify with so many concerns with the policies which are gender neutral, which treat the sections like male and the female similarly in the society, equally in the society, by ignoring the historical inequalities that are existing in a society like India especially. The next question that we have is basically related to the institution of marriage. The next question that we have is related to the institution of marriage. And the question reads, intercaste marriages between castes which have socio-economic parity have increased to some extent, but this is less true of interreligious marriages. Discuss. Now, it takes into account the caste equations when somebody is marrying, as well as the religious equations when somebody is marrying. It takes into account the caste equations, and it also takes into account the religious equations while somebody is marrying. And if you remember, in India's case, marriage is governed by a rule which is called as caste endogamy. That is, an individual is required to marry within one's own caste, right? And there is a ban on marrying with a person, or there is a social ban or social taboo of marrying with a person belonging to a different caste. That has been the norm in the Indian society. That has been a value in the Indian society. That is how the tradition has governed in terms of the caste endogamy in case of India. However, what we are witnessing right now is that the intercaste marriages have started to happen. What we are witnessing is intercaste marriages are now happening. However, the intercaste marriages are not happening between people belonging to different strata in the society. And you might be remembering that if you look at the caste system, the society is arranged into a hierarchy. The society is arranged into a hierarchy wherein there are certain castes which are treated as the upper castes whose status is high, and there are certain other castes which are treated as the lower castes. Right? So what they are highlighting is that now the intercaste marriages that are happening, they are happening between people who belong to what? Who belong to have a similar socio-economic condition, who have socio-economic parity. Now the socio-economic parity or the idea of economy and social status in a society can be related to the idea of another system of social stratification which is called as class-based social stratification. We can relate it to what? Class-based social stratification, which is also a hierarchy that exists in the society. There is also a system of hierarchy that exists in the society. Normally, it's a feature of the industrial societies where you find what? Stratification, that is, groups are arranged into top to bottom hierarchy in terms of their access to status, wealth, and power. Right? But the only possibility, the only benefit of the class system, or only good thing about the class system is there is possibility of social mobility. There is possibility of social mobility, which is missing sometimes in the case of the caste system. Now, what we are witnessing here is, in the case of these intercaste marriages, which are happening between people belonging to the similar socio-economic background, we are witnessing a kind of what? Intersection of caste with class, right? Which simply means what? Which simply means that people are still not ready to marry people belonging to lower sections of the society. Class as an idea is now becoming more important in some parts of the India. Now, where is it becoming important? We all know that the changes that we see in the caste system are far more widespread in the case of urban India and not so much in the case of rural India. Rural India still gives so much weightage to the caste as an idea. This scenario is changing in the urban area because what happens is people are exposed to people from diverse cultural background, right? Their economic compulsions are high. Urban areas are areas which witness high levels of individualism. So all these are present in those areas, and in such a scenario, we need to look at this from the perspective that in the urban areas we are finding such marriages more and not so much in the rural areas, and it is a manifestation of the intersection of the caste and the class to a great extent, right? Then you look at the second part which says that, but this is less true of the interreligious marriages. Absolutely, this is less true of interreligious marriages because if you look at the idea of religion, right? Religion has been one of the defining features of the cultural diversity in case of any country, right? But the animosity between the different religions is leading, which has increased considerably in the recent times because of the ideas like communalism, because of the political speeches, hate speeches that you see, right? And the rise of ethno-nationalism based on the religious ideas. We are witnessing a backlash against anybody trying to marry outside the religion. And this is also done with a fear that it might lead to conversions, right? So religions have been skeptical. The people belonging to particular religions have been skeptical about their declining populations, right? And there is some amount of conservatism, orthodoxism that is associated with interreligious marriages, right? So even when in the urban areas we're witnessing that the inter-caste marriages are being allowed, the interreligious marriages still remain a taboo in case of the Indian society. That is what is the question that has been asked. You needed to analyze it in such a manner. And we know that one of the manifestations of the interreligion marriages and they being a taboo in the society is visible in the form of a term that is very often used in the media, which is called as the love jihad. So you needed to analyze it from this perspective, where you needed to highlight that caste endogamy is the one which has been governing the idea of the marriage in the India. However, with changing socio-economic circumstances, the changes that are coming up in the Indian society because of economic development, westernization, modernization, and globalization, we are witnessing changes. These changes are more so visible in the urban areas, less visible in the rural areas, right? And class is becoming an important factor in the people marrying within the same socio-economic level of the hierarchy in the society, right? However, it is not the same in the case of religion because of increasing communalism, because of politicization of the religion, because of religious polarization, because of rise in ethno-nationalism based on the religion, as well as the notions that it might lead to conversion. That has been one of the prominent problems with the interreligious marriages. The next question is, it is talking about in dealing with socio-economic issues of development. It reads, in dealing with the socio-economic issues of development, what kind of a collaboration between government, NGOs, and private sector would be most productive? They are asking us that what kind of a collaboration is required in these three sectors that are prevalent in an economy. Now, normally what happens is, if you look at the India's developmental story, the India as a nation, we adopted right after the independence the concept of welfare state. And in this concept of the welfare state, the basic notion was the state is going to provide many of the services and also various social sector initiatives will be undertaken by the government only, right? Or the state only. However, we have found that in the later part, in the 80s and the 90s, the government sector has an inherent problem. One is the government sector sometimes falters because of its inherent problems, that it is bureaucratic. There is idea of corruption. There are delays, there are leakages in the government policies and the plans. This makes us move towards certain solutions, right? And because of this, we try to involve in the developmental process some of the other players in the developmental industry, like the NGOs and the private sector. Now, why private sector? Because private sector comes up with certain strengths. However, it is not willing to participate in some of the areas without a guarantee of the government. So private sector has benefits in terms of expertise in a particular field. They are experts in a particular field. Private sector also has the requisite capital that is required for any kind of socio-economic developmental issue, right? But normally the private sector would not be willing to get into that direction without the government support, because they might want some amount of guarantee, some kind of support, because without their support they cannot simply go and do this thing. For example, let's say a private sector wants to participate in the healthcare services in the rural area. The government will have to provide it some amount of guarantee, right? Or the private sector can collaborate with the government sector in the development of, let's say, the primary health center. This is how it can happen. And this can normally happen by what? The private sector and the government's collaboration can happen with public-private partnership, which can be one of the ways in which the government can collaborate with the private sector, bringing in their expertise, their capital to some extent, right? One of the best examples of this can be quoted as Delhi Metro. Delhi Metro, which is simply what? A public transportation system. It is a public transportation system. In the public transportation system, we know that public transport is mainly the prerogative of what? The government, right? However, this PPP model has functioned well, and it is transporting a huge number of population in case of Delhi, right? So this public-private partnership is what? Collaborative. This collaboration is leading to what? The solution of various socio-economic policies, socio-economic problems, and is also contributing to what? The development of these areas. So that is one way of the collaboration. Then you see, because the socio-economic factors that you see here, because the socio-economic sectors, say socio-economic development that we are concerned with here, we know that sometimes even though the government has presence in some of the most backward areas and have a know-how of the vulnerable sections, like let's say the women, let's say the lower castes, let's say children, right? Or in the area of health and education, we know that government has a role to play, or government is the one which is looked upon by the people who are belonging to the vulnerable sections in the society. So government definitely has a primary role to play in those areas. But the problem is government does not have that reach in those sections. Government is not that active a player in those sections. And sometimes the bureaucracy is not that sensitive to the needs of these vulnerable sections. On the other hand, NGOs have an expertise, or they have the capability, or they have the know-hows of the problems that are faced by these vulnerable sections. They have the know-hows of these vulnerable sections, right? They are more trusted by these vulnerable sections, right? And they have basic ideas, fundamental solutions to the problems that are there, which are faced by the vulnerable sections. In accordance with that, the NGOs, they collaborate with the governments, they collaborate with the private sector to bring about the changes in the society, to bring about socio-economic development in the society. One of the best examples of this that can be quoted is, let's say, the Akshay Patra Foundation. This does what? It collaborates with the government to provide midday meal, which is the biggest food and nutritional intervention for children by the government. Another initiative is Integrated Child Development Scheme, ICDS. In this also the government is collaborating. Then sometimes sometimes the private sector along with the NGOs directly collaborate with the government for bringing about the development, and this can be done through what? Corporate social responsibility. The corporate social responsibility is a type of what? Collaboration of the government with the private sector to bring about what? Socio-economic development. In such cases, in the CSR, we have the examples of Infosys Foundation, Reliance Foundation, Tata Foundation, right? You can say Bill Gates and the Melinda Foundation. They're doing what? These are basically private entities, but private entities which are trying to do what? Collaborate with the government. The Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation is basically related to the idea of they are like charitable trusts, etc. But in general, they are playing an important role in collaboration with the government. So why is it required in the first place? First is, as it has been conceived, is that the government has a role to play in bringing about socio-economic development. Because we have embarked upon a welfare state right from the beginning, it still forms an important part of our DPSP. But government has its inherent problems like bureaucratic hurdles, like corruption, like delays, leakages, all sorts of problems, right? And government does not sometimes have the expertise in all the fields. That is why the intervention of the private sector is required, which has the expertise, which has the capital. Similarly, government might not have much reach with the vulnerable sections. So government does what? Government involves the NGOs, which have the expertise, have the connect, have the trust of the vulnerable sections. And we have so many examples like Delhi Metro, like the Akshay Patra Foundation in the midday meal scheme, like the Infosys Foundation, which is a CSR initiative which involves the private sector in the socio-economic developmental initiatives. The next question that we see here is related to regional disparity in case of India. And this year they have, and this is a repeated theme that is asked time and again every year, they have a question on regional disparity in case of India, or regionalism to some extent. Here the question is, it is requiring us to differentiate between the diversity and disparity. Now, regional disparity, if you first try to define it, it can be simply looked at as what? As regional inequality. Regional inequality in terms of what? Economic development. In terms of what? Socio-economic development. Right? It can be seen to be what? The inequality in terms of structural development, right? In terms of access to, in terms of employment opportunities, all these can be seen as what? Regional disparity. And we all know that in case of India, this regional disparity is manifested in different parts of India. For example, there are various states which are witnessing high rates of economic growth. For example, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, some of the southern states, they are witnessing what? High rates of economic development, right? States like Kerala, etc., they have what? High levels of socio-economic development, right? Some of the states have high infrastructural development, and the southern India has more economic opportunities because some of the biggest urban centers are present in those areas. For example, Mumbai, for example, Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, Coimbatore, all these are what? Centers of economic employment. But these capabilities or these options, these opportunities are not so available in the northern India, where there are only few bigger centers like Delhi, NCR region, right? And not many other centers which can feed the high rate of employment that is required in the country, right? Then the next part asks us that how does it differ from the diversity? Now, diversity simply is not very problematic in nature. Diversity in case of India, if you look at it from the regional diversity, so regional diversity is definitely there in case of India. Regional diversity is basically in terms of what? Various cultural practices, various geographies, right? Various religious practices. We have what? These regional diversities. For example, language is one of the important markers of the regional diversity. And you might be knowing that the states have been reorganized on the basis of what? Language only. The state reorganization has been done on the basis of language to a great extent. For example, Tamil Nadu, mainly Tamil speaking population. Karnataka, Kannada speaking population. Kerala, Malayali speaking population. Andhra, Telugu speaking population, right? So these are what? These are regionally diverse areas, right? These are diverse areas. Diversity inherently is not a problematic thing, right? And if you compare diversity with the disparity is inequality. Diversity does not necessarily mean inequality. For example, northeastern states are different as compared to Punjab. Punjab is different as compared to Jharkhand. Jharkhand is different as compared to Tamil Nadu in terms of what? Cultural practices, languages, food practices. All these are what? Markers of diversity in India. However, if you look at it from the regional disparity perspective, disparity is seen in terms of what? These factors. In terms of these factors, you might find sometimes low levels of economic opportunity, economic development in maybe northeastern states, in maybe states like Bihar, in states like Uttar Pradesh, right? But you might find what? More economic growth happening in Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, in some of the other southern Indian states like Gujarat. It's Gujarat also one of the state which is having what? High levels of economic development. In terms of employment opportunities, we see and manifest it as what? As the migration that is there. The regional disparity manifests itself in the form of what? Migration. And we know that the employment related migration is happening from what? North India to South India. North India to South India. Right? And it is sometimes also leading to what? Some amount of tensions also. For example, there are some cultural assertions that we see sometimes in case of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and in the past we have witnessed the same thing in case of Maharashtra also. Right? So we need to look at it from this perspective. Then we have what? How serious is the issue of regional disparity? Here you can highlight the seriousness in terms of these parameters. For example, economic development and economic growth. So if you look at the reports of the gross state domestic product of the states, you look at what? If you compare them, you'll find that the states like Maharashtra and Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, they are growing at a better better GDP growth rate as compared to what? States like Rajasthan or Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, right? They are not growing at a very quick rate, or their base GDP is very, very low as compared to these other states, right? Then you see what? In terms of socio-economic development, Kerala is a standout state. Tamil Nadu has good credentials, while there are certain other states which do not have much good credentials in terms of what? Disparity. That's the extent. Infrastructure development, employment opportunities. North Indian states have high rates of unemployment. Southern Indian states have lesser rates of unemployment. This is the approach that we need to follow in writing such answers. So the whole point is, if you see these questions, you need to be able to first write down the differences conceptually. For example, gender equality with gender equity, right? For example, regional disparity with diversity. Both of these things need to be incorporated in writing the answers. If you look at this question, it is related to another important section in the Indian society region. If you look at this question, it is related to another important question in the Indian society section, which is overlapping with even the GS paper 2, which is social justice. So if you look at this question, it reads, despite comprehensive policies for equity, we have already seen this concept of equity in the previous question. But despite this, comprehensive policies for equity. Equity means you are going to provide a situation, you are going to provide a policy framework which is going to provide them support, which is going to be more as compared to the normal citizens, right? Equity requires you to support those who are weaker in the society. Equity requires you to treat specially the old age people, treat specially women, treat specially the lower caste people. Why? Because these are vulnerable sections. They are not as empowered as the others, right? So in this case also, it requires that despite the comprehensive policies of equity and social justice, underprivileged sections of India are not yet getting the full benefits of affirmative action envisaged by the Constitution. They are not getting the full benefits of what? Affirmative action. Now, affirmative action at a general level can be seen to be synonymous with what? Reservation, which has been incorporated in Article 15, 16, etc. We have the provisions for reservation for the vulnerable sections, because now we have what? Reservations for SCs, STs, OBCs, and we have economically weaker sections. This question says that despite such affirmative action policies, why do we not have why the underprivileged sections are not getting the full benefits of them? Now the answer to this question can be what? You can use so many ideas. For example, first is, let's say the idea of the affirmative action is based on the idea of caste to a great extent, right? And still, because of the presence of the caste-based discrimination in various areas, the full potential with which the lower sections of the society can utilize these benefits has not been materialized in reality, right? There is lack of political will sometimes, because of which also this does not happen in reality, right? Then you see what? Sometimes the guidelines that are provided by the government for benefiting or taking the benefit of these policies that are there in the Constitution are not very clear. For example, in terms of the creamy layer in the OBC reservation, right? There is a lot of confusion going on regarding what constitutes the creamy layer, right? Sometimes these sections misuse them. Sometimes some of the sections misuse them to create the non-creamy layer certificates, right? and because of which it is not reaching the people who actually deserve it, right? Even in case of the economically weaker sections, the certificates sometimes are seen to be spurious. They are not properly made, and they are not made for the actually eligible people, right? While the people who are already influential, they create such a situation in which they get hold of the EWS section certificates and they benefit from it, right? Sometimes you need specific policy framework, which are also missing, right? Which are also missing, because of which the policies are not catered to meet the specific needs of these vulnerable sections which require what? The affirmative action. That again becomes a problem. And then last but not the least, government has not been spending much on creating the foundation which is required for upliftment of any other section. This foundation is based on two important parameters, which is health and education. If these two are taken care of, if these two are provided to them diligently, it will form a sound base upon which they can then utilize the policies for affirmative action. For example, you might have seen that because of the reservations and the affirmative action, sometimes people belonging to the lower caste, they get admissions into IITs, etc. But because the foundation is not that great, sometimes they have to quit the IITs. The rate of attrition from the IITs is higher for the people belonging to the reserved quota. That has been a continuous problem, and it is one problem is because of this, the lack of sound foundation. Other problem is also because of what? The inherent caste discrimination mindset that is there. Agree? So in such a scenario, that is why, because of the interplay of so many factors, the full realization of the benefits of the affirmative action by these lower castes has not been arrived at till now. That forms the base of this answer. You can write it down in this perspective. The next question is basically, the question looks like it is a question of globalization, but it is actually a question of women issues. It looks like a question of globalization, but it is actually a question of women issues, wherein the question says that the globalization has increased what? Urban migration. By whom? Skilled, young and unmarried women. Skilled, young and unmarried women from various classes. How has this trend impacted their personal freedom and their relationship with family? How has this trend impacted upon their personal freedom with relationship with their family? Personal freedom and relationship with their family. If you look at this question, the idea that is, let's say, the urbanization itself. Urbanization leads to what? The urban areas becoming the growth magnets. They are growth magnets. These are the areas where you have the highest employment opportunities. Agree? And the urbanization as a process has been expedited by the idea of globalization. Everybody agrees to this idea. Urbanization as an idea has been expedited what? Expedited by globalization, which is basically what? The interlinkages that are developing between the economies of the world. The interdependency that is increasing between the economies of the world, that we can see it here. Right? In such a scenario, what is the benefit? Women belonging to the rural areas, women belonging to different areas, when they migrate into the urban areas, first positive thing that we see related to their personal freedom is that it leads to their empowerment. It leads to their empowerment. It provides them what? Financial independence. Agree? It provides them what? Financial independence. It provides them with what? With gainful employment, which is basically an improvement over the traditional attitudes where the women were supposed to be what? Homebound. they had to take care of what? Household chores, as well as they were the primary caregivers. These were the notions that were attached to them. They are being replaced by what? Empowerment, financial independence, gainful employment. This has definitely contributed to what? Their personal freedom. Because once a woman becomes financially independent, that is when she can enjoy her personal freedom. Otherwise, the notion in the Indian society has always been that the women have been seen to be dependent upon their male counterparts, right? Right from the young age till the old age. That has been the scenario. But this scenario is transforming with urbanization, where we are seeing what? The migration leading to these benefits in terms of their personal freedom. However, the urbanization itself leads to what? Some serious problems also, right? And these positive ideas related to what? Their personal freedom can also be related to the idea of individualism that takes roots into their mindset, right? It leads to rational approach towards the life. All these are benefits. But urbanization sometimes leads to what? Anonymity. Anonymity leads to stressful lifestyles. There are concerns of safety. There are concerns of safety that need to be handled, right? Sometimes the families are not very receptive of these ideas, that they do not allow the women to go independently and work in the urban areas. That leads to what? Strain in the familial relations. That leads to strain in the family relations. These are the problems. Then you see what? Sometimes the families force them to follow a traditional line of thought in terms of the idea of the marriage. The families force them to follow a traditional line of thought where they force them to marry at an early age, right? But women try to resist it. But sometimes they also succumb to these problems. But in many of the scenarios, women try to remain unmarried, right? But this idea of remaining unmarried is again seen as a taboo in many of the sections of the society, at least in back home in the rural areas, right? All these create the problems in their relationship with the family. Although on the one hand, it is getting empowered, but it is leading to so many problems on the other side. So the idea is basically we need to create urban spaces. We need to create a change in the mindset of the society where the women getting employment in the urban areas is more acceptable. It becomes a kind of accepted norm in the society, right? And this new dynamics that are coming up in the family, these new dynamics that come up in the family when the women are getting jobs, etc., it should be taken in a proper light. This last question in the Indian society section is basically about critically analyze the proposition that there is a high correlation between India's cultural diversities and socio-economic marginalities, right? What they are trying to do here is diversity is one of the important topics, one of the important features of the Indian society. This diversity needs to be seen vis-a-vis the socio-economic marginalities, socio-economic marginalization, as well as the vulnerability. It needs to be correlated. Vulnerability needs to be correlated in this scenario, right? Now, diversity inherently is not problematic, that we've already seen, because a similar question was asked in which we were required to what? Relate disparity with diversity. We were required to relate regional disparity with regional diversity or diversity in general, right? If you look at diversity, diversity can be seen from which perspectives? Language, religion, tribes, caste. They are asking us to highlight if this proposition is fine, critically analyze this. There is a higher correlation between India's cultural diversities and socio-economic marginalities, right? So you'll have to highlight both the sides in such answers. Both the sides. That on the one hand, there is no direct correlation. In some cases, there is no direct correlation. In some cases, there is direct correlation. In some cases, there is direct correlation that we need to look at here, right? If you look at the direct correlation, if you look at the correlation between the India's cultural diversities and socio-economic marginalities, if you look at the language as a marker, right? Language is related with the idea of what? The states, right? In this case, it is said that normally the socio-economic parameters for northern Hindi speaking belt are pretty less. In this sense, it can be seen to be having what? Some amount of correlation, that the Hindi speaking belt has had certain socio-economic problems, because of which we are witnessing what? Lack of employment opportunities in this area, right? Lack of socio-economic development, and because of this we see high rates of migration into the southern parts of India, right? Then you see, if you relate it to the religion as an idea of diversity, right? Some of the minority religions are well off in the Indian society. For example, Jains, for example, Parsis, they are amongst the richest and their socio-economic developmental parameters are also pretty high. However, in some other cases, the religious minorities like Muslims, they have high rates of poverty amongst themselves. This can be seen. However, this correlation is far more established in case of the tribes and the castes, right? Because tribes are considered to be what? Socio-economically marginalized, right? They are seen as what? Weaker sections. And to this extent, we can highlight that there is a great amount of correlation between the tribe as a marker of diversity, and within the tribes also there is so much correlation between the diversity in the tribes and the socio-economic marginalities. For example, the tribes of Andaman Nicobar, they are far more backward, right? The tribes of central India are backward as compared to tribes in the northeastern states, because the government intervention is happening more in those areas. Agree? The tribes in the central Indian areas they are also suffering from what? Naxalism, etc. So you can correlate in the case of the tribes, and of course in the case of the caste, where the lower caste groups are normally associated with what? Socio-economic marginalities. Agree? So in such a scenario, we need to highlight this on the one hand, and we can also substantiate it by telling what? That affirmative action itself correlates with what? Correlates the idea of cultural diversity. For example, it bases it on the basis of caste and the tribal status. With what? With reservations because of their inherent socio-economic marginalities, right? However, in many other cases, such correlation does not stand. In many other cases, this correlation does not stand. But to a great extent in these scenarios, we can highlight that there is enough correlation that is found here. Now these questions are basically related to the idea of these questions. Now these questions are related to the syllabus. In the syllabus, they're related to the idea of social justice, and social justice is an integral part of GS paper 2. Social justice is an integral part of GS paper 2, where normally we have issues related to what? Related to the human resource development, the social justice that we provide to various vulnerable sections. What are the government schemes? How the government handles health and education? All these are related to that particular section, right? In this line, if you look at this question, poverty and malnutrition create a vicious cycle adversely affecting the human capital formation. What steps can be taken to break the cycle, right? Inherently in this question, we should start by explaining the idea of human capital. Now, what is the idea of the human capital? Human capital, if you see this origin of the term, it is similar to what? Economic capital. Which means what? This economic capital can be invested to bring about economic growth. Similarly, the human population, if it has to be seen as a capital, has to focus upon what? Those populations which are first working age, right, which are skilled and which have the capability of, or which have the employment opportunity, or who are prepared for both these because of educational. They are prepared for acting as a capital for education based on the preparation in terms of health, education and health, etc. This is the basic idea behind human capital. Only then the working age population can do what? The amount of employment and the work that they are going to do, it will again be an asset. It is again going to be something which is valued by a society. It is also going to be something that is valued by the society, right? That is going to be a part of this thing, right? So now it is saying that the human capital formation as an idea, that the human resources, if they are not being provided enough opportunities in terms of education, health, etc., they are going to be impacted by what? Poverty and malnutrition, because the education and health, which are seen to be one of the important inputs in the human capital formation, they are definitely going to be impacted because of what? Poverty and malnutrition. Imagine the young population, which is working age population, does not have enough resources to acquire quality and skill based education. Will they be able to participate? Will they be able to act as a capital? No. Health, if you look at malnutrition, right? Malnutrition right from the childhood till the age of adult, right? Even in the case of, let's say, adolescence, or after a person becomes adults, if they are not taking enough nutrition, if they are still malnutritious, it is going to lead to what? It is going to increase, in fact, the disease burden in a nation, and they will never be treated as what? Human capital. That is why there is a vicious cycle of what? Poverty and malnutrition, which leads to, or which adversely impact the human capital formation in a nation. Simply to address this, we need to break this cycle of poverty and malnutrition, and for this we will have to follow what? A holistic approach, which involves right from the childhood. First is what? To have interventions to remove poverty. For example, we have interventions to remove poverty like MG Narega, right? Or the government provides various assistance to the vulnerable sections in terms of direct cash transfers, right? To break malnutrition trap, we need to focus upon what? Right from the life cycle of the individual, from the childhood, when mother is pregnant. So the government needs to provide what? Nutritional support through various policies to mother, the newborn child, the neonatal delivery that has been done through the child also, and then during his whole life cycle, we need to provide support in terms of nutritional support, and this can be done through various policies. For example, ICDS is one of the initiative. Midday meal is supposed to provide nutritional security also. In this, a lot needs to be done. It needs to incorporate, let's say, the ideas of including certain minor minerals which are required for vitamin deficiency, etc. They can also be included here in these kinds of cases. So it has to be a full life cycle approach for removing the problem of malnutrition and poverty, which can ultimately lead to what? Effective capital formation in a society. Now this next question is related to healthcare, and this is also one of the important parts of social justice in the paper too. It requires us to identify and highlight that in a crucial domain like public healthcare system, the Indian state should play a vital role to contain the adverse impact of marketization of the system. Right? Suggest some measures through which the state can enhance the reach of public healthcare at the grassroots level. This is what they are highlighting. They highlight that the entry of the private sector into the healthcare facility, right, definitely leads to what? Some benefits, because it leads to what? Super specialty hospitals being present, right? If private sector takes part into the healthcare services, it can invest in research. Inherently, the entry of the market or the private sector into the healthcare is not a problem. However, it comes with its own set of problems. For example, it increases the cost of treatment. It increases the cost of treatment. It reduces the accessibility to the healthcare services. Why? Because majority of the people cannot afford it, so it becomes unaffordable also. All these things are the issues associated with what? The entry of the private sector or the marketization of the system, right? In some cases, the private sector, when it is part of, let's say, the medicines that are being provided to the people, so these medicines and their price also go up, right? Because of the patent regime, which is strict sometimes, right? Because of which there are so many problems. In such a scenario, what the government needs to do is what? First, it needs to regulate this. Regulate the private sector in the healthcare facilities, right? But not just this. It is not only this is not the only solution that they are asking about. They are asking that what role should the government play in containing the adverse impact of marketization, and suggest some measures through which what? The state can enhance the reach of the public healthcare at the grassroots level. The problem is the private sector will find it lucrative to base themselves in some of the urban centers only, right? And they would not be much interested in many of the rural areas of the nation, right? Because rural areas are not going to be profitable, right? However, in some cases, when they establish themselves in the rural areas, they become more exploitative. Why? Because in the rural areas, there is lack of awareness. Which makes it even more problematic, right? So to contain all of these problems, first is to regulate, but to attract them in the rural areas itself is a difficult job altogether. In such a scenario, what the government needs to do? Government needs to focus upon all the things that we already know related to intervention in the health sector. For example, first, improvement in primary health centers at the grassroots level. Second, government should increase spending on health, right, where the target is to increase it to 2.5% of the GDP by 2025. Implementation of what? Implementation of policies like Ayushman Bharat more effectively, right? Further, the entry of insurance sector should be promoted, because of which what is going to happen? If insurances are there with the people, it is going to help them in accessing the private sector related facilities that are there, because the healthcare expenditure of a family creates a great amount of burden on the poor family especially. It is normally said about the Indian society, especially related to the middle class and the poor sector, that every Indian middle class family is just one hospitalization away from poverty. And for reducing that kind of problem of the marketization, we need to provide what? Effective insurance policies. One of the initiatives, of course, your Ayushman Bharat, which takes care of this thing, right? So in the terms of all these possibilities that are there, then national health policy should be effective. This can be one of the solution. Then you look at the ideas as in government should provide what? Affordable, accessible and easily available healthcare facilities. For that, they will have to provide what? Cheap medicines in terms of what? The generic medicines. These generic medicines can play a crucial role. Then the healthcare workers, they are not willing to work in those areas. So there is a need for what? People belonging to rural background, but they are skilled. They need to be made, who are trained into the medical education. They need to be made a part of the healthcare facilities at the bottom. And not just this, we need to take benefits from the Ayush, where we need to also incorporate the alternative medicines that are available at the grassroots level for preventive healthcare, right? Plus, there is a need for what? Decentralized trauma centers, and the whole life cycle of the disease in a country needs to be handled by the government through these effective policies, and government has already initiated various policies. We can use them in our answer.
Unacademy. Let's crack it.